Hello, hello everyone. Sorry it took me a second. I was having scuff as usual. What is a stream without scuff? But on the plus side, I unplugged it, plugged it back in again, and it worked. So, we're good to go. Beautiful. Sounds good, dear. I hope you have a good sleep and good rest. We're gonna turn off the sound on my phone. I'm gonna give it another minute or two for anybody to filter on in. This is a much more climactic music than last time, but I don't know if I hate it or not. I think I kind of like that it seems to go a little more with the theme of the book, but I do think I need to turn it down just a smidge. Alright. Hopefully that's still audible on everybody else's end, but not oppressive. Okay. Make sure to turn off my alarm. Yep. Friendly reminder to take your meds if you haven't yet today. This will unfortunately not be as long of a stream as I usually do, since I have been having a weird allergic reaction today. It's something that I've had for a long time and it just kind of happens. But this one, unfortunately, is my upper lip, so I look like I have a very fat lip. And not just the normal kind that a water buffalo would have. The kind that makes talking a little bit painful. But I enjoy getting our reading done. Alright. Well, at this point, I'm guessing that we're going to be getting ads not too long. So I will start reading until we get those ads. I'm assuming pretty much everybody who's going to be here is here for right now. To recap, we had gone through the majority of Moll Flanders the first few years of her life, and we were getting past her marriage to her first husband and the continuation of her marriage to her second husband, who had basically gone bankrupt and commissioned to his creditors. So I will start from where we left off. My husband was so civil to me, for still I say he was much of a gentleman, that in the first letter he wrote to me, he let me know where he had pawned 20 pieces of fine Holland for £30, which we were above, were worth above 90 pounds, and enclosed me the token for the taking of them, paying the money, which I did, and made in time above 100 pounds of them. Having leisure to cut them and sell them to private families, an opportunity offered. However, with all of this and all that I had secured before, I found upon casting things up my case was very much altered, and my fortunes much lessened. For including the Hollands and a parcel of fine muslin which I carried off before, and some plate and other things, I found I could hardly muster up 500 pounds, and my condition was very odd, for though I had no children, I had one by my gentleman draper, but it was buried. Yet I was a widow bewitched. I had a husband, and no husband, and I could not pretend to marry again, though I knew well enough my husband would never see England any more, if he lived 50 years. Thus I say, I was limited from marriage, what offer soever might be made of me. I have to turn this down just a tiny bit more again. Hopefully it still audible to those within chat. And I had not one friend to advise me in the conditions I was in, at least not one who I could trust the secret of my circumstance to, for if the commissioners were to have been informed where I was, I should have been fetched up, and all I had saved be taken away. Upon these apprehensions, the first thing I did was to go quietly out of my knowledge, and go by another name. This I did effectually, for I went into the Mint too, took lodgings in a very private place, dressed me up in the habit of a widow, and called myself Mrs. Flanders. Here, however, I concealed myself, and though my new acquaintances knew nothing of me, yet I soon got a great deal of company about me, and whether it be that women are scarce among the people that generally are to be found there, or that some consolation in the miseries of that place are more requisited than on other occasions, I soon found that an agreeable woman was exceedingly valuable among the sons of affliction there, and that those that could not pay half a crown in the pound to their creditors, and run in debt at the sign of the bull for their dinners, would yet find money for a supper if they liked the woman. However, I kept myself safe yet, though I began, like my Lord Rochester's mistress, that loved his company but would not admit him further, to have the scandal of a whore without the joy, and upon this score, tired with the place and with the company too, I began to think of removing. I didn't get the notification that it was going to run ads. Well, I will wait. Silly ads. It's supposed to give me a notification that it's going to run the ads. It didn't. I wonder where it was. I'll just start back. Okay, now that the ad break is done, I will go back. However, I kept myself safe yet, though I began, like my Lord Rochester's mistress, that loved his company but would not admit him further, to have the scandal of a whore without the joy. And upon this score, tired with this place, and with the company too, I began to think of removing. It was indeed a subject of strange reflection for me, to see men in the most perplexed circumstances, who were reduced some degree below being ruined, whose families were objects of their own terror and other people's charity, yet while a penny lasted, nay, even beyond it, endeavouring to drown their sorrows in their wickedness, heaping up more guilt upon themselves, labouring to forget former things which now it was the proper time to remember, making more work for recompense, and sinning on as a remedy for the sins past. But it is none of my talent to preach. These men were too wicked, even for me. There was something horrid and absurd in the ways of sinning, for it was all a force even upon themselves. They did not only act against conscience, but against nature, and nothing was more easy than to see how sighs would erupt their songs, and paleness and anguish sit upon their brows, in spite of the forced smiles they put on. Nay, sometimes it would break out of their very mouths, when they had parted with their money for a lewd treat or a wicked embrace. I have heard them, turning about, fetch a deep sigh, and cry, "What a dog am I! Well, Betty, my dear, I'll drink thy health, though," meaning the honest wife that perhaps had not a half-crown for herself, and 3 or 4 children. The next morning they were at their penitentials again, and perhaps the poor weeping wife comes over to him, either bring him some account of what his creditors are doing, and how she and the children are turned out of doors, or some other such dreadful news. And this adds to his self-reproach. But when he was thought and poured on till he is almost mad, having no principle to support him, nothing within him or above him to comfort him, but finding it all darkness on every side, he flies to the same relief again, to the drink it away, debauch it away, and falling into company of men in just the same such condition with himself, he repeats the crime, and thus he goes every day, one step onward with his ways to destruction. Hi, Cloud.
Excuse me. There. There, fucker. Do you need assistance?
I was not wicked enough for such fellows as these yet. On the contrary, I began to consider here very seriously what I had to do, how things stood with me, and what course I ought to take. I knew I had no friends, no, not one friend or relation in the world, and that little I had left apparently wasted, which when it was gone, I saw nothing but misery and starvation was before me. Upon these considerations, I say, and filled with horror at the place I was in, I resolved to be gone. I had made an acquaintance with a sober, good sort of a woman, who was a widow too, like me, but in better circumstances. Her husband had been a captain of a ship, and having had his misfortune to be cast away, coming home from the West Indies, was so reduced by the loss that though he had saved his life then, it broke his heart and killed him afterwards, and his widow, being pursued by the creditors, was forced to take shelter in the Mint. She soon made things up with the help of friends, and was at liberty again, and finding that I rather was there to be concealed than by any particular prosecution, and finding also that I agree with her, or rather she with me, in a just abhorrence of the place and of the company, she invited me to go home with her, till I could put myself in some posture of settling into the world to my mind. withal telling me that it was 10 to 1, but some good captain of a ship might take a fancy to me and court me in that part of the town where she lived. I accepted her offer and was with her half a year, and should have been longer, but in that interval what she proposed to me happened to herself, and she married very much to her advantage. But whose fortune soever was upon the increase, mine seemed to be upon the wane, and I found nothing but present except 2 or 3 boatswains and such fellows. But as for the commanders, there was generally of 2 sorts. One such as having good business, that is to say, a good ship, resolved not to marry, but with advantage. 2 such as being out of employ, wanting a wife to help him to ship. I mean, 1, a good wife who, having some money, could enable them to hold a good part of the ship themselves, so to encourage owners to come in, or a wife who, if she had not money, had friends who were concerned in shipping, and so could help to put the young man in a good ship, and neither of those was my case, so I looked like one that was to lie on hand. This knowledge I soon learnt by experience, that the state of things was altered as to matrimony, that marriage was here the consequences of politic schemes for forming interests, carrying on business, and that love had no share or but very little in the matter. That, as my sister-in-law at Colchester had said, beauty, wit, manner, sense, good humour, good behaviour, education, virtue, piety, and any other qualification, whether of body or mind, had no power to recommend, that money only made a woman agreeable, that men chose mistresses indeed by the just of their affections, and it was requisite for a whore to be handsome, well-shaped, have a good mind, and a graceful behaviour, but that for a wife no deformity would shock the fancy, no ill qualities the judgment. The money was the thing, the portion was neither crooked or monstrous, but the money was always agreeable, whatever the wife was. On the other hand, as the market run all on the man's side, I found the woman had lost the privilege of saying no, that it was a favour now for a woman to have the question asked, and if any young lady had such arrogance as to counterfeit a negative, she would never have the opportunity of denying twice, much less of receiving that false step, and accepting what she had seemed to decline. The men had such choice everywhere that the case of the women was very unhappy, for they seemed to ply at every door, and if the man was by great chance refused at one house, he was sure to be received at the next. Besides this, I observed that the men made no scruples to set themselves out, and to go a fortune hunting, as they called it, when they had really no fortune themselves to demand it, or merit to deserve it, and they'd carry it so high that a woman was scarce allowed to inquire after the character or estate of the person that pretended to her. This I had an example of in a young lady at the next house to me, and with whom I had contracted an intimacy, where she courted by a young captain, and though she had near £2,000 to her fortune, she did but inquire of some of his neighbours about his character, his morals, and substance, and he took occasion at the very next visit to let her know truly that he took it very ill, and that he should not give her the trouble of his visits any more. I heard of it, and I had begun my acquaintance with her. I went to see her upon it. She entered into a close conversation with me about it, and embosomed herself very freely. I perceived presently that though she thought herself very ill used, yet she had no power to resent it, that was exceedingly piqued she had lost him, and particularly that another of less fortune had gained him. I fortified her mind against such meanness, as I called it. I told her that as low as I was in the world, I would have despised a man that should think I ought to take him upon his own recommendation only. Also, I told him that as she had a good fortune, she had no need to stoop to the disaster of the times, that it was enough that the men could insult us, that they had but little money, but if she suffered such an affront to pass upon her without representing it, she would be rendered low prized upon all occasions, that a woman could never want an opportunity to be revenged of a man that has used her ill, and that there was ways enough to humble such a fellow as that, or certainly women were the most unhappy creatures in the world. Sorry, I need a dip. She was very well pleased with the discourse, and told me seriously that she would be very glad to make him sensible of her resentment, and either to bring him on again or have the satisfaction of her revenge being as public as possible. I told her that if she would take my advice, I would tell her how she should obtain her wish in both these things, and that I would bring the man to her door again and make him beg to be let in. She smiled at that, and soon let me see that if he came to her door, her resentments were not so great to let him stand there long. However, she listened willingly to my offer of advice, so I told her the first thing she ought to do was a piece of justice to herself, namely, that whereas he had reported among the ladies that he had left her, and pretend to give the advantages of the negative to himself, she should take care to have it well spread among the women, which could not fail of an opportunity to do, that she had inquired into his circumstances and found he was not the man he pretended to be. Let them be told, too, madam, said I, that you found he was not the man you expected, and that you thought it was not safe to meddle with him, that you heard he was of an ill temper, and that he boasted how he had used the women ill upon his many occasions, and that particularly he was debauched in his morals, etc., the last of which indeed had some truth in it, but I did not find that she seemed to like him much the worse for that part. She came most readily into all this, and immediately she went to work to find instruments. She had very little difficulty in the search. For telling her story in general to a couple of her gossips, it was the chat of the tea tables all over that part of the town, and I met with it wherever I visited. Also, as it was known that I was acquainted to the young lady herself, my opinion was very much often asked, and I confirmed it with all the necessary aggravations, and set out his character in the blackest of colors. And as a piece of secret intelligence, I added what the gossips knew nothing of, that I had heard he was in very bad circumstances, that he was under a necessity of a fortune to support his interests with the owners of the ship he commanded, that his own part was not paid for, and if it was not paid quickly, his owners would put him out of this ship, and his chief mate was likely to command it, who'd offered to buy the part which the captain had promised to take. Excuse me. I added, for I was heartily piqued at the rogue, as I called him, that I had heard rumor too that he had a wife alive at Plymouth and another in the West Indies, a thing which they all knew was not very uncommon for such kind of gentlemen. This worked as we both desired it, for presently the young lady at the next door, who had a father and mother that governed both her and her fortune, was shut up, and her father forbid him the house. Also, in one place more, the woman had the courage, and however strange it was, to say no, and he could try not where, but he was reproached with his pride, and that he pretended not to give the woman leave to inquire into his character and the like. But this time he began to be sensible of his mistake, and seeing all the women on the side of that side the water alarmed, he went over to Ratcliffe and got access to some of the ladies there. But though the young women there were, according to the fate of the day, pretty willing to be asked, yet such was his ill luck that his character followed him over the water, so that though he might have had wives enough, yet it did not happen among the women that had good fortune, which was what he wanted. But this was not all. She very ingeniously managed another thing for herself, for she got a young gentleman who was a relation to come and visit her 2 or 3 times a week in a very fine chariot and good liveries, and her 2 agents and I also presently spread a report all over that the gentleman came to court her, that he was a gentleman of £1,000 a year, and that he was fallen in love with her, and that she was going to her aunt's in the cities, because it was inconvenient for the gentleman to come to her with his coach in Rothrear, the streets being so narrow and difficult. This took immediately. The captain was laughed at in all companies, and was ready to hang himself. He tried all the ways possible to come to her again, and wrote the most passionate letters to her in the world, and in short, by great application, obtained leave to wait on her again, as he said, only to clear his reputation. At this meeting she had her full revenge of him, for she told him she wondered what he took her to be, that she should admit any man to a treaty of so much consequences, that of a marriage, without inquiring into his circumstances, that if he thought she was to be huffed into wedlock, and that she was in the same circumstances which her neighbours might be in, to take up the first good Christian that came by, he was mistaken, that in a word his character was really bad, and he was very ill beholden to his neighbours, and that unless he could clear up some points in which she had justly been prejudiced, she had no more to say to him, but gave him the satisfaction of knowing that she was not afraid to say no, either to him or any man else. With that she told him what she had heard, or rather raised herself by many means, of his character, his not having paid for the part he pretended to own of the ship he commanded, of the resolution of his owners to put him out of the command, and to put his mate in his stead, and of the scandal raised on his morals, his having been reproached with such and such woman, and his having a wife at Plymouth, and another in the West Indies, and the like, and she asked him whether she had not good reason, and these things were not cleared up, to refuse him, and to insist upon having satisfaction in points so significant as they were. He was so confounded at her discourse that he could not answer a word, and she began to believe that all was true by his disorder, though she knew that she had been the raiser of these reports herself. After some time he recovered a little, and from that time was the most humble, modest, and importunate of men alive at his courtship. She asked him if he thought she was at her last shift, that she could or ought to bear such treatment, and if he did not see that she did not want those who thought it worth their while to come further to her than he did, meaning the gentleman whom she had brought to visit her by the way of sham. She brought him by these tricks to submit to all possible measures to satisfy her, as well as of his circumstances as of having his behavior. He brought her undeniable evidence of his having paid for his part of the ship. He brought her certificates from the owners that the reports of their intending to remove him from the command of the ship was false and groundless. In short, he was quite revered of what he was before. Thus I convinced her that if the man made their advantages of our sex in the affair of marriage, upon the supposition of there being a choice to be had, and of the women being so easy, it was only owning to this, that the women wanted courage to maintain their ground, and that according to my Lord Rochester, a woman's ne'er so ruined but she can revenge herself on her undoer man. After these things the young lady played her part well, so well, though, that she resolved to have him, and that indeed having had him was the main bent of her design. Yet she made his obtaining her to be to him the most difficult thing in the world. And this she did, not by a haughty reserved carriage, but by a just policy, playing back upon him his own game, for as he pretended by a kind lofty carriage to place himself above the occasion of a character, she broke up with him upon that subject, and at the same time that she made him submit to all possible inquiry after his affairs, she apparently shut the door against his looking into her own. It was enough to him to obtain for her for a wife. As to what she had, she told him plainly that as he knew her circumstances, it was but just she should know his, and though at the same time he had only known her circumstances by common frame, yet he had made so many protestations of his passion for her, that he could not ask no more, but her hand to be grand request. And like Ramble, according to the custom of lovers, in short, he left himself no room to ask any more questions about her estate, and she took the advantage of it, for she placed part of her fortune so in trustees, without letting him know anything of it, that it was quite out of his reach, and made him to be very well contented with the rest. It is true she was pretty well besides. That is to say, she had about £14,000 in money, which she gave him, and the other, after some time, she brought to light as a prerequisite to herself, which he was to accept as a mighty favor, seeing though it was not to be his, it might ease him to the article of her particular expenses. And I might add that by this conduct the gentleman himself became not only more humble in his application to her to obtain her, but also was more the more an obliging husband when he had her. I cannot but remember the lady how much they placed themselves below the common station of a wife, which, if I may be allowed not to be partial, in low enough already, I say they place themselves below their common station, and prepare their own mortifications by their submitting so to be insulted by the men beforehand, which I confess I see no necessity of. This relation may serve therefore to let the ladies see the advantages not so much on the other side as the men think it is, and that though it may be true the men have but too much choice among us, and that some women may be found who will dishonor themselves, be cheap, and too easy to come at, yet if they will have the women worth having, they may find themselves as uncomfortable as ever, and that those that are otherwise have often such deficiencies when had, as rather recommended the ladies that are difficult, than encourage the men to go on with their easy courtships and expect wives equally valuable that will come at first call. I think I actually need to call it here today. I am starting to have a lot of pain in my lip, but I think I might change I might come back a little later today and do some streaming of a game. I hope that everybody enjoyed that. We ended on page 60 for today. So it didn't get very far, but we did get a ways. I am just having much too much pain in my lip right now. Gonna snooze the ad break. Let me see if I can find someone to raid quick. It does not look like I have anybody that I can raid on, so we will just end it here for today, at least for now. I will probably be back later for either another game or something else. But yeah, thank you so much for showing up, and I hope you all have a fantastic rest of your day. Bye-bye.